Imagine spending your entire life not knowing where you came from. No parents, no family, no answers. Just silence where your story should have been. Now imagine walking into a job that was supposed to change your life and being told in front of everyone that you were nobody, that you didn't belong there, that you should stay invisible and be grateful for it. That is exactly where Ellie's story begins. But here is what nobody in that room knew, what nobody could have possibly predicted. The woman who humiliated her, the one with the power, the name, and everything Ellie never had, was hiding a secret that connected them in a way neither of them could have imagined. And the truth? It was closer than either of them ever realized. This is the story of two women, one devastating secret, and the moment everything they thought they knew about themselves was turned completely upside down. Stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you see everything that came before it. The morning Ellie Brown walked into the Beaumont and Associates conference room with a 40-page report tucked under her arm, she had been awake for 19 hours straight. She had not planned it that way. The night before had started like any other, a quiet apartment, a cup of tea gone cold on the desk, and the low hum of the city outside her window. But somewhere around 11 o'clock, while cross-referencing contract clauses for a case she had not officially been assigned to, she found it. A single paragraph buried on page 31 of a commercial lease agreement, overlooked by 3 senior associates and 2 partners. A termination clause so poorly worded that, if the opposing counsel found it first, it would unravel 18 months of work and cost the firm's most important client somewhere in the range of $4 million. Ellie read it twice. Then she made a fresh cup of tea, sat back down, and spent the next 7 hours building the most thorough legal analysis she had ever written. By 6 in the morning, she had printed it, bound it, and was already on the subway. The conference room on the 14th floor was filling up when she arrived. Senior associates in tailored suits, 2 of the firm's named partners at the far end of the table, and a row of clients whose combined net worth could have bought the building twice over. Ellie had worked at Beaumont and Associates for 4 months. She knew the room, she knew the case. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned early in life to rely only on herself, that what she was holding could save it. She was halfway to the head of the table when the door opened behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. The room told her, the way the air changed, the way conversations dropped mid-sentence, the way even the most senior people in the room seemed to adjust their posture without realizing it. Dr. Caroline Beaumont walked in like someone who had never once questioned whether she belonged in a room. She was dressed in charcoal gray, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that suggested hours of work made to look like none at all. She was 31 years old and had been named the youngest partner in the firm's history 2 years earlier, a fact that the firm's website mentioned in the first paragraph of her biography, and that Caroline herself managed to communicate without ever saying it directly. She was brilliant. Everyone said so. She was also, as Ellie had learned over 4 months of careful observation, the kind of brilliant that had never once been asked to make room for anyone else. Caroline's eyes moved across the room with practiced efficiency and landed on Ellie. She stopped. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not recognition exactly, something harder to name. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool, measuring expression that Ellie had come to know as Caroline's default setting. "What is that?" Caroline asked. She was not looking at the report. She was looking at Ellie. "A contractual analysis for the Mercer case," Ellie said. "I found a termination clause in the—" I didn't ask what was in it. Caroline crossed the room in 4 unhurried steps and held out her hand. Ellie gave her the report. Caroline looked at the cover page. Then she looked at Ellie. Then she set the report down on the table, not with force but with a kind of deliberate lightness that managed to communicate contempt more effectively than any gesture Ellie had ever seen. "You're a paralegal," Caroline said. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The room was absolutely silent. You organize files, you make coffee, and you stay invisible. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. You don't think, you don't argue, and you certainly don't walk into my conference room with opinions. A pause. Is that clear enough for someone like you? Not a single person at that table moved. Ellie held Caroline's gaze for 3 full seconds. She thought about the 19 hours. She thought about the clause on page 31. She thought about every room she had ever walked into in her life, where someone had looked at her the way Caroline was looking at her now, like she was furniture that had made the mistake of speaking. Then she picked up the report, tucked it back under her arm, said perfectly clear, and walked out. She was at the elevator when she heard the conference room door open behind her. One of the junior associates, a young man named Daniel who had always been decent to her, stepped into the hallway and glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "the clause is on page 31. Hartwell just found it." Ellie pressed the elevator button. "I know," she said. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. And as the doors closed, she caught her own reflection in the polished metal. A woman in her late 20s, dark eyes steady, jaw set, the kind of face that did not give things away easily. She had taught it not to. She had grown up in Sycamore House, a group home in the small town of Delford, 3 hours from the city. No parents, no siblings, no one who had come looking for her. She had put herself through school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness, had built a reputation in legal support work that had nothing to do with who she knew and everything to do with what she could do. She was at Beaumont and Associates because a partner at her previous firm had recommended her without being asked. She had not arrived here by luck or by connection. She had arrived here because she was good. In the bathroom on the 12th floor, Ellie ran cold water over her wrists, the way she had learned to do when she needed to think clearly. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she took the report out from under her arm, uncapped the red pen she kept in her jacket pocket, and underlined the termination clause on page 31. She stared at it. "Find out who she is," she said quietly to her reflection, "and then find out who you are." She capped the pen, folded the report in half and slid it into her bag. She had work to do. Beaumont and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of the Harlow building, a glass and steel tower in the heart of Crestfield's financial district that had been designed at considerable expense to communicate one thing above all else, that the people inside it were not to be questioned. The 14th floor was where the real work happened. Associates bent over desks, paralegals moving between offices with stacks of files, the low, constant hum of a machine that never fully stopped. The 15th was for partners, its hallways quieter and its carpets noticeably thicker. And the 16th, the top floor, accessible by a private elevator that required a key card almost nobody had, belonged to James Beaumont. The firm had been his idea, his name, and for 32 years his kingdom. He was 64 now, silver-haired and sharp in the way that certain men became with age, not softened by it but refined, the unnecessary parts worn away until what remained was mostly will. He appeared on the 14th floor perhaps twice a week, usually for a partners' meeting or a client dinner. And on those occasions, the atmosphere of the office changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. People sat up straighter. Conversations became more deliberate. Even Caroline, who deferred to no one, carried herself differently when her father was in the building. Ellie had observed all of this in her first week and filed it away in the part of her mind she reserved for things that mattered. What she had also observed, though she had not yet found a category for it, was the way James Beaumont had looked at her the first time they were in the same room. It had been a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her time at the firm. A partners' meeting had run long, and James had stepped out into the 14th floor corridor just as Ellie was coming around the corner with a set of deposition files. They had nearly collided. James had stepped back, and Ellie had apologized, and for a moment, a brief, strange moment that she had thought about more than once since, he had gone completely still. Not the stillness of mild surprise, something deeper than that. His assistant, a composed woman named Patricia who had worked for him for 15 years, had appeared at his elbow and said his name twice before he responded. He had recovered quickly, offered a courteous nod in Ellie's direction, and continued down the hallway without a word. Ellie had watched him go, then continued to the file room and told herself it meant nothing. She was still telling herself that. Caroline's pattern, by contrast, required no interpretation. It was simply a fact of the office, like the bad lighting in the copy room or the coffee machine on the 14th floor that took 4 minutes longer than it should. Caroline Beaumont identified talent the way an immune system identified a foreign body, automatically, efficiently, and with the immediate intention of neutralizing it. It was Marcus Webb who first said it out loud. Marcus had joined the firm 6 weeks before Ellie, transferred from a litigation practice in Harlow's sister city to the east. He was methodical and unhurried in the way that good lawyers often were, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything he heard. He had started working alongside Ellie on a complex commercial dispute in her 3rd week, and by the end of the first day, it had been clear to both of them that they thought about problems in compatible ways. "She doesn't do it to everyone," he said one afternoon without preamble, as he and Ellie were reviewing discovery documents in the small conference room on the 14th floor. "Have you noticed that?" Ellie looked up from the page she was reading. "Caroline," he said, "she's not like that with Janet, or with Paul, or with most of the junior associates." He leaned back in his chair. "Only the ones who are actually good." Ellie considered this. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to make you feel accurately informed," Marcus said, and went back to his document. Ellie almost smiled. She was still thinking about what he had said that evening, when she stayed late to finish a brief, and she was thinking about it again the next morning when she arrived to find a new face in the office, a woman she had not seen before, sitting in the small reception area outside the Human Resources suite on the 14th floor, with a leather portfolio on her lap and the patient, self-contained expression of someone who was comfortable waiting. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, Ellie guessed, though something about her made the number feel imprecise. She had light brown hair cut simply, and the kind of face that had once been striking and had settled, over time, into something quieter but no less present. She was dressed plainly and well. She looked like someone who had learned at some point in her life to take up as little space as possible. Patricia introduced her to the floor that morning as Helen Marsh, an external consultant brought in to review the firm's personnel structures and onboarding processes. "Standard procedure for a firm of this size," Patricia said, with the tone of someone who considered the whole exercise mildly unnecessary but professionally obligatory. Most people nodded and returned to their work. Ellie noticed her because Helen noticed her first. It happened in the main corridor just before lunch, one of those brief, unremarkable crossings that filled the working day, 2 people moving in opposite directions with somewhere to be. Ellie was carrying a file. Caroline was walking ahead of her, 20 feet further down the hall, moving toward the partner offices with her phone to her ear. Helen was standing near the window at the corridor's midpoint, portfolio in hand, apparently waiting for someone. As Ellie approached, Helen's eyes moved to her face, and something happened in the woman's expression that Ellie could not immediately name. Not alarm, not recognition in any ordinary sense. Something more private than that, something that passed across her features and was gone before Ellie had fully registered it. Then Helen's gaze moved further down the corridor to Caroline's retreating figure, and the same thing happened again. Quieter this time, more complicated. Her eyes traveled between them once, Ellie, then Caroline, then back to Ellie, and then she turned toward the window and looked out at the street below. Ellie passed her without stopping. That afternoon, in the break room, A woman named Sandra, who had been with the firm for 11 years, poured herself a coffee and looked at Ellie with the appraising expression of someone about to say something she had been holding for a while. "Can I ask you something?" Sandra said. "Sure," Ellie said. "Have you ever met Dr. Beaumont before you came here?" "No," Ellie said. "Why?" Sandra tilted her head slightly. "From behind, I sometimes confuse you two. Same posture, same way of walking into a room." She paused. "It's strange. Probably nothing." She took her coffee and left. Ellie stood in the break room for a moment longer than necessary, turning the comment over in her mind. Then she let it go. The way she had learned to let things go that did not yet have a shape she could hold. On her way back to her desk, she passed the corridor window where Helen Marsh had been standing earlier. Helen was gone. But for a reason Ellie could not have explained, she stopped at the window for a moment and looked out at the street below, the way Helen had. She did not know what she was looking for. She did not find it. She went back to work. The thing about working in a place like Beaumont and Associates was that you learned very quickly to read the temperature of a room before you walked into it. Ellie had learned this in her first week. By her second month, she had refined it into something close to instinct. The slight tension in a junior associate's shoulders that meant a filing deadline had been missed. The particular quality of silence in the partner's corridor that meant a client call had gone badly. The way the entire 14th floor seemed to collectively exhale on Friday afternoons when Caroline left early for a client dinner. What she had also learned, with the same careful attention, was the precise geography of Caroline's antagonism. It was not random. That was the first thing. Random cruelty was, in its own way, easier to navigate. You braced for it generally, the way you braced for bad weather. Caroline's was different. It was targeted and deliberate and always public. She chose her moments with the instincts of someone who understood that humiliation only truly lands when there are witnesses. A correction delivered in an empty room was just a correction. The same words in front of 8 people became something else entirely, and she chose her targets carefully. Ellie had watched her long enough now to see the pattern Marcus had identified. Janet from filing, Paul from research, the 3 junior associates who arrived earliest and left latest, Caroline left them alone. They were competent and diligent and entirely unthreatening, and Caroline had no interest in people who did not threaten her. It was the ones who were genuinely good that she came for. Ellie understood this not because it made her feel better, it did not, but because understanding a pattern was the first step to working around it. She documented everything: dates, times, exact words, the names of everyone present. Marcus had suggested it quietly after the conference room incident, and Ellie had already started before he finished the sentence. It was the kind of thing she had always done: kept records, noted details, trusted information over feeling. What she had not expected was how quickly the documentation would become something else. A habit, then a ritual, then a source of something she did not have a precise word for, but that felt, distantly, like control. She was reviewing her notes one evening in late October when Marcus appeared in the doorway of the small office they shared on the 14th floor and set a folder on the desk between them without a word. Ellie looked at it, then at him. "Kellerman arbitration," he said, sitting down. "I've been through the billing records 3 times and the numbers don't align with the work log." Ellie opened the folder. The billing records were meticulous in the way that fabricated things often were. Too clean, too regular, the kind of precision that appeared when someone had gone back and made adjustments after the fact. She cross-referenced 2 columns and found the first discrepancy in under 4 minutes. "That's not an accounting error," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It isn't." They sat with that for a moment. It was not the first irregularity they had found. Over the previous 3 weeks, working across 3 separate cases that Richard Holt had either led or supervised, they had accumulated a quiet, growing catalogue of things that did not quite add up. a motion filing dated 2 days before the event that supposedly prompted it, a client communication log with a gap of 11 days that the billing records did not reflect, a settlement figure that bore no clear relationship to the case's documented value. Individually, each irregularity could be explained away. Collectively, they were forming a shape. Richard Holt was a senior partner, one of only 4, and had been with the firm for 21 years. He was the kind of man who filled a room without appearing to try, who laughed easily and remembered the names of people's children, and had a way of making you feel, in his presence, that you were slightly more important than you actually were. He was well liked in the way that certain people were well liked, without anyone being able to say exactly why. Ellie had found him pleasant and faintly unsettling in equal measure from the first week, and had noted, without drawing any conclusions, that he was one of the very few people in the building around whom James Beaumont's manner shifted, became slightly more guarded, more contained, like a man choosing his words from a smaller set than usual. She had filed that observation away. She was beginning to understand why. The original records would have to be somewhere, Marcus said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the folder in a way that suggested he had already thought carefully about what he was about to say next. The versions in the system have been touched, but Holt is old school. He keeps physical files on anything that matters to him personally. A pause. There's only one place in this building where physical records aren't subject to the standard filing protocol. Ellie looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything, Marcus said. You're absolutely suggesting something, Ellie said. He almost smiled. I'm observing that the information probably exists. What anyone does with that observation is entirely their own decision. Ellie closed the folder. She thought about page 31 of the Mercer contract, and the 19 hours, and the conference room, and the particular way Caroline had set the report down on the table. She thought about the folder in front of her, and the 11-day gap, and the settlement figure that made no sense. She thought about a lot of things. I need to think about it, she said. Marcus nodded, as if that were the answer he had expected. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, I've been here 8 months. In that time, I've watched 3 good people leave this firm because staying became untenable. One of them was better than anyone currently holding a partner title. He looked at her steadily. I don't think that's a coincidence. He left. Ellie sat alone in the office for a long time after that, the folder open in front of her and the city doing its indifferent evening things outside the window. She thought about what Marcus had said, and she thought about Richard Holt's 2 clean billing records, and she thought, not for the first time, about the look on James Beaumont's face in the corridor 3 weeks into her time at the firm. That strange, unguarded stillness before he recovered himself and walked away. She had concluded sensibly that he was the kind of employer who researched his staff. She still believed that. Mostly. It was the following afternoon that James stopped her. She was on her way to the document room, arms full, moving quickly. He was coming from the opposite direction, alone for once, without Patricia at his elbow. They slowed simultaneously, the way 2 people do when a collision becomes possible. Miss Brown, he said. The formality was standard. He addressed all non-partner staff that way. How are you finding the Kellerman materials? I understand you've been working across the discovery documents. Fine, thank you, Ellie said. It's a complex record set. James nodded. There was a brief pause of the kind that suggested he had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. You went to Alderton College, he said, before your certification program, scholarship student. Something shifted very slightly in Ellie's chest. Alderton College was not on her resume. She had attended for 1 year before the funding fell through, and she had not included it because 1 year at an institution she had not graduated from seemed more likely to invite questions than to answer them. It was not a secret. It simply was not something she had documented anywhere within the firm. That's right, she said, keeping her voice even. James held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, something she could not name and that was gone before she could examine it. "Good instincts are developed early," he said, in the manner of someone offering a general observation. "Or not at all." Then he nodded once, pleasantly, and continued down the corridor. Ellie stood still for a moment after he had gone. She ran the conversation back from the beginning. The detail was specific and it was accurate, and there was no professional explanation for how he had it. She turned the possibilities over with methodical care. Background checks were standard for new hires, but they were conducted by an external firm, and the results were held by HR, not something a founding partner would typically have memorized to the level of a single year at an unfinished degree. It was possible he had reviewed her file independently. It was possible he took an unusual personal interest in staff hires. It was possible there was a perfectly unremarkable explanation she was not seeing. She shifted the files in her arms and continued to the document room. That evening, in her apartment, she wrote the exchange in her notebook. The exact words, the exact pause before he said Alderton, the expression she could not name. She looked at it for a moment, then wrote underneath it, "Most likely explanation. He researches staff. Thorough, controlling. Note and move on." She closed the notebook. Down the hall from her apartment, her neighbor's television murmured through the wall. Outside, rain had started against the window. Ellie made tea, sat back down at her desk, and returned to the Kellerman billing records. She moved on, but she did not quite let it go. The decision, when it finally came, did not feel like a decision at all. That was the thing about crossing certain lines. The ones that mattered rarely announced themselves as such. They arrived quietly, dressed as the next logical step, and you were already through them before you had properly considered whether to go. It was a Thursday morning in mid-November when Marcus came to Ellie's desk with a specific piece of information and the carefully neutral expression he wore when he'd already decided something but was waiting for her to catch up. "Holt had a meeting with the Kellerman client 8 days before the arbitration date," he said, setting a single printed page on her desk. "There's no record of it in the system. No billing entry, no communication log, nothing. But the building's visitor register, the physical one at the front desk, the one nobody thinks about because everything else is digital, has his name, client name next to it. Floor 14. Ellie looked at the page. It was a photograph of a handwritten register entry, slightly blurred at the edges but entirely legible. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I asked the front desk attendant if I could see the October register," Marcus said. "He handed it to me. Nobody has thought to restrict access to it because nobody has thought about it at all." He paused. "Whatever was discussed in that meeting, it isn't anywhere in the official record, which means the record of it, if it exists, is physical and personal." They looked at each other. The 16th floor had always been a kind of myth on the 14th. Present, referenced occasionally, but essentially theoretical to anyone below partner level. James Beaumont's office occupied its northeastern corner, a large room that several people had seen the inside of, and described in ways that varied enough to suggest that memory in the presence of James Beaumont became unreliable. Beside it, accessible through a connecting door that was always closed, was a secondary room that everyone referred to, without apparent irony, as the archive. It was where James kept the documents that did not go into the system. Nobody knew precisely what that meant, but everybody understood it. The 16th floor required a key card. Marcus had one. He had been issued it 3 weeks earlier for a client meeting that James had asked him to attend in his stead, a temporary authorization that should, technically, have been deactivated afterward. Whether it had been was a question Marcus had not asked, and that the system apparently had not answered. "James is in court today," Marcus said. "He left at 8. Patricia confirmed his schedule to the partner's assistant this morning, and I happened to be standing nearby." Ellie looked at the visitor register entry again. She thought about the 3 good people Marcus had watched leave the firm. She thought about the billing records with their 2 clean columns and their 11-day gap. She thought about Richard Holt's easy laugh and the way James Beaumont's manner shifted almost imperceptibly whenever Holt was in the room. "If we find what we're looking for," she said, "it needs to be documented in a way that can actually be used. Photographs, timestamps, chain of custody." "Agreed," Marcus said, "and if we don't find anything, this conversation didn't happen." "Also agreed." Ellie stood up, reached for her phone, and slid it into her jacket pocket. "Then let's go," she said. The private elevator to the 16th floor was at the end of a short corridor behind the partner's suite, partially obscured by a decorative partition that gave it the quality of something meant to be overlooked. Marcus held his keycard to the reader. The light turned green. The doors opened. Neither of them spoke on the way up. The 16th floor was quieter than Ellie had expected. Not the held breath quiet of somewhere forbidden, but the ordinary quiet of a space that was simply not often occupied. There was a small reception area with 2 chairs that looked unused, a narrow hallway leading to James's main office, and beside it, the connecting door to the archive. It was unlocked. The archive was not large. 2 walls were lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, dark grey, labelled in a system that was immediately legible to anyone with a legal background. A 3rd wall held built-in shelving with bound case volumes arranged chronologically. In the center of the room was a single table, empty and clean. Marcus went to the filing cabinets on the left wall, where the labels suggested active client matters. Ellie moved to the right, where the labels were older, dates reaching back 15-20 years. She was looking for Kellerman. She was looking for anything that matched the gaps in the official record. She found Kellerman in the 4th cabinet, 3rd drawer. The physical file was considerably thicker than its digital counterpart, which was itself telling. She photographed each page methodically, working quickly but without rushing, the way she had trained herself to work when the stakes were high enough that mistakes became expensive. Marcus, across the room, had found something and was photographing it without comment. She noted this but stayed focused on her own section. She had been working for perhaps 12 minutes when her hand reached the back of the Kellerman drawer and closed around a second folder that had been placed behind the hanging files, flat against the back of the drawer, without a label, the kind of placement that was either disorganized or deliberate, and nothing about this room suggested disorganization. She pulled it out. It was thin, 6 or 7 pages at most, she estimated from the weight, held together with a single binder clip. The cover page was blank. She opened it. The first document was a formal record, the kind issued by a civil registry, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges and carrying the specific institutional formality of something generated by a government body. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, because her mind was still in the Kellerman billing records, still oriented toward client matters and arbitration dates and financial discrepancies. Then she read the name at the top, her own name, Ellie Brown. She stood very still. The document was a birth record, not the standard certificate she had been issued by Sycamore House, the one that listed her origins as unknown and her place of birth as Delford County General Hospital. This was something else, older, more specific. It named the hospital where she had been born, a private facility in Crestfield, and it listed a date that matched her own, and it listed, in the field reserved for parental information, a name she recognized, James Arthur Beaumont. Below that, in the same field, Helen Marsh. Ellie read it again, then she read it a 3rd time, with the focused, deliberate attention she brought to contract language when the meaning of a clause would determine everything. The words did not change. There was a second document behind the first, another birth record, same date, same hospital, same parental information. A different name, Caroline, no surname recorded, a handwritten note in the margin, in what she would later recognize as James's handwriting. Placed with E. Beaumont family per arrangement. Ellie's hand had stopped moving. She was aware, distantly, of Marcus still working across the room. She was aware of the ambient sounds of the building, the low mechanical breath of the ventilation system, the faint vibration of the elevator somewhere below them. She was aware of the document in her hands and the name on it, and the date and the hospital, and every implication that followed from those details, branching outward with the remorseless logic of a legal argument that had already been made and could not be unmade. She turned to the next page. It was a photograph. Small, slightly out of focus in the way of photographs taken without much light. A young woman in a hospital corridor, somewhere in her 20s, Ellie estimated, with light brown hair and a face that was turned slightly away from the camera. On the back, in a different hand from the marginal note, HM, April. Ellie turned the photograph over and looked at the face again. She had seen that face before. Not in a photograph, not in a memory she could precisely locate. In the corridor of the 14th floor 3 weeks ago, looking out a window at the street below, Helen Marsh. She was still looking at the photograph when the sound reached her. Footsteps in the corridor outside, unhurried and distinct, moving toward the archive. Not James's stride, which she had catalogued without meaning to over 4 months of proximity. Someone else's. She looked at Marcus. He had already heard it. There was a single wardrobe cabinet against the wall to her left, tall dark wood slightly ajar. Ellie slid the folder back into the drawer exactly as she had found it, closed the drawer without sound, and moved to the cabinet in 4 quiet steps. Marcus was beside her in 3. They pulled the door to behind them, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 inches, enough to see the room, not enough to be seen. The archive door opened. Richard Holt stepped in. He was carrying a leather folder under one arm and moving with the ease of someone who had been in this room many times before. He went directly to the filing cabinet on the left wall, Marcus's section, opened the second drawer, and stood looking at its contents for a moment. Then he closed it, checked the drawer above it, and stood still in the center of the room, with the expression of a man performing a calculation. Ellie did not breathe. After a moment that lasted considerably longer than it was, Holt turned and walked back out of the archive, pulling the door closed behind him. His footsteps moved down the corridor and faded. Neither Ellie nor Marcus moved for another 30 seconds. Then Ellie pushed the cabinet door open and stepped out, and Marcus followed, and they stood in the archive in silence for a moment that felt separate from the ordinary passage of time. "Did you get what you needed?" Ellie asked. Her voice was steady. "Yes," Marcus said. He looked at her face. "Did you?" Ellie thought about the document in the 4th cabinet, the name at the top, the date, the hospital, the photograph of a young woman in a corridor looking slightly away from the camera. "Yes," she said. They left the archive, took the elevator back down to 14, and returned to their desks by separate routes without discussing what they had found. That was the agreement, implicit and understood. They would process it separately, then talk. Ellie sat at her desk and opened a document on her screen that had nothing to do with what she'd just seen, and she stared at it without reading it, and she let the information settle into her the way cold water settles, spreading outward from a single point until it reaches every available space. She had gone up to the 16th floor, looking for the truth about Richard Holt. She had found something she had not been looking for at all, and the woman in the photograph, the woman with the light brown hair who looked slightly away from the camera, was currently somewhere on this floor, carrying a leather portfolio, taking up as little space as possible. Ellie reached into her bag, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and wrote 2 letters at the top, HM. She underlined them once. Then she began to think. She did not go to Helen that day or the next. This was not avoidance. Ellie did not avoid things. It was one of the few qualities she had always been certain of in herself, even when she was certain of very little else. What she did instead was what she always did. when a problem presented itself in a form she had not anticipated. She gathered information until she understood its shape well enough to approach it without being undone by it. She spent 2 evenings cross-referencing everything she could find: public records, professional registrations, the thin digital footprint that Helen Marsh had left across the years. She found a work history that was modest and consistent, a series of human resources roles at mid-sized firms across 3 different cities, none of them overlapping with Beaumont and Associates until the current consulting engagement. She found no connection to Crestfield before that, or none that was visible in the records available to her. What she did not find was any record of a child, which meant she understood that James had been thorough. On the 3rd evening, she called the administrative office of Sycamore House in Delford, the group home where she had grown up, and asked to speak with whoever currently managed the historical records. She was transferred twice, and then told that the records from that period were held in physical storage and would require a formal request to access. She filed the request that night and was told it would take 10 to 15 business days. She noted the timeline, set a reminder, and continued. What she had already found, the birth record in James's archive, the parental names, the second document with Caroline's name, and the handwritten note, was not proof of everything, but it was enough to understand the outline. 2 children, born on the same day at the same hospital in Crestfield, one placed with the Beaumont family, one placed at Sycamore House in Delford. James Beaumont listed as the father of both. The outline was clear. What it meant, what she was supposed to do with it, how she was supposed to feel about it, who exactly she was in relation to it, those were not questions that responded to information gathering. Those were questions of a different kind entirely, and Ellie had spent enough of her life sitting with unanswerable questions to know that forcing them did not help. She gave herself the 10 days. On the 8th day, Marcus came to her desk in the early afternoon and sat down without being invited, which was something he only did when the matter was not the kind that could wait for an invitation. "I need to tell you what I found on 16, he said. "I know," Ellie said. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." He looked at her for a moment. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." She almost smiled. "Tell me." What Marcus had found in the filing cabinet on the left wall of the archive was a secondary set of billing records for 4 cases spanning 8 years. The original versions, before adjustment, which told a story that diverged from the official record with the clean, irrefutable clarity of documented fact. Richard Holt had been systematically overbilling select clients and redirecting the surplus through a series of intermediary accounts. The amounts were not enormous by the standards of a firm this size, which was, Marcus noted, almost certainly deliberate. Large enough to be worth the effort, small enough to fall below the threshold of routine scrutiny. But that was not the most important thing he had found. Behind the billing records, in a sealed envelope that had been opened and resealed at least once, the adhesive edge had been compromised and smoothed back down with the kind of care that was itself a form of evidence. Marcus had found a series of letters. James to Richard, Richard to James, 11 in total spanning 14 years. They were not detailed. James, Ellie was beginning to understand, was a man who communicated the essentials and nothing more, but they were unambiguous. Richard Holt knew about the birth records in the 4th cabinet. He had known for 14 years, and he had been paid in various forms to continue knowing and saying nothing. Ellie sat with this for a long moment. "He wasn't just running a billing scheme," she said. "No," Marcus said. "The billing scheme is almost a side project. The primary leverage has always been James." He paused. "Which means if James dies, or the secret comes out another way, Holt loses his insurance. And a man who's been living on insurance for 14 years becomes unpredictable when it runs out." Ellie nodded slowly. She was thinking about the letters and the billing records and the resealed envelope, and she was thinking about the document with her own name on it. And she was thinking about the fact that all of it existed in the same room, in the same building, on a floor that Richard Holt clearly still had access to. "We need to move carefully," she said. "Very carefully," Marcus agreed. She told him then, not everything, not the photograph or the full weight of what she had understood standing in the archive with the document in her hands, but enough. She told him about the birth records, about the names, about the second child placed with the Beaumont family and the handwritten note in the margin. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence of the particular quality that follows information that is too large to respond to quickly. "Caroline," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Ellie said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Are you all right?" It was such a direct question, asked with such uncomplicated sincerity, that Ellie found herself briefly without an answer, which almost never happened. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Marcus nodded, as if that were entirely reasonable. "What do you want to do?" Ellie looked at her notebook, at the 2 letters she had written and underlined 8 days ago. "First," she said, "I need to talk to Helen Marsh." She found Helen late that afternoon, in the narrow corridor near the building's secondary stairwell, a route that Helen had, Ellie had noticed over the preceding weeks, made habitual. Whether this was coincidence or preference was a question Ellie had not previously thought to ask. She was beginning to think there was no such thing as coincidence in this building. Helen saw her coming and did not look for an exit. That, more than anything, told Ellie something important. They stood facing each other in the corridor, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the building went about its ordinary business around them, phones ringing distantly, a door closing somewhere above, the low percussion of a city afternoon beyond the windows. "How long have you been looking for me?" Ellie asked. Helen's expression moved through something complicated before it settled. "A long time," she said. Her voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it that way was faintly visible, the way strain shows in a structure that is holding more weight than it was designed for. "Tell me from the beginning," Ellie said. And Helen did. She told it quietly and without decoration. The way people tell things they have rehearsed many times in private and are now, finally, saying out loud to the person they were always intended for. She had been 23, she said, and had been working at the firm for 14 months as an administrative assistant when she and James, she paused here briefly and then continued, when the situation had developed. She had not been naive, she said. She understood what it was and what it wasn't. What she had not understood, or had not allowed herself to understand, was how completely she would be removed from any decision about what followed. When she told James she was pregnant, he had been calm in a way that she now recognized decades later as the calm of a man who had already begun solving the problem. He told her, weeks after the girls were born, that both children had been placed at Sycamore House, that it was the right thing, that she was in no position, financially, practically, to provide for them, and that he would ensure they were cared for. He made it sound like an arrangement, like a reasonable conclusion to an unreasonable situation. She had believed him because she had not had the resources at 23 to do anything else. It had taken her 11 years to begin looking, another 7 to find the records that told her what had actually happened, that only one child had gone to Sycamore House, that the other had gone somewhere else, somewhere that James had taken considerable care to leave unrecorded. It had taken her 4 more years to find Ellie. "The Sycamore House records still had your placement documents," Helen said. "Partial ones, enough. It took time, but I found your name and then I found where you were working." A pause. "I applied for the consulting engagement 3 months before you joined the firm. I didn't know you were coming here. When you walked in on your first day..." She stopped. "You recognized me," Ellie said. "You look like I did at your age," Helen said quietly. "And you look like..." She stopped again. Something changed in her face. She turned her head slightly in the direction of the partner offices and then back. Ellie watched her. "There's something I need to show you," Ellie said. She had printed 2 photographs that morning, screen captures from her phone, slightly grainy but entirely legible. She took them from her jacket pocket now and held them out. The first was the birth record with her name and James's and Helen's. The second was the second birth record, with Caroline's name and the handwritten note in the margin. Helen took them. She read the first one. Her hands were still. She read the second one. Ellie watched the moment of understanding arrive. It did not come all at once. It came the way certain realizations do in increments, each one opening into the next, the full weight of it assembling itself piece by piece until it was impossible to look away from. Helen looked up. Her eyes moved involuntarily in the direction of Caroline's office. "She's here," Ellie said. "She has been the whole time." Helen looked back down at the photograph in her hands. Then she closed her eyes, briefly, and when she opened them again, they were bright with something that had nowhere to go. "Not yet." "She doesn't know," Ellie said. It was not a question. "No," Helen said. "She doesn't know." They stood in the corridor for another moment, the 2 photographs between them and 30 years of silence on every side. Then Ellie said, "I need to talk to Caroline." She found Caroline in her office at 6:30, when the floor had mostly emptied, and the city outside the windows had shifted into its evening register. She knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer, which she knew would irritate Caroline and which she had decided was appropriate. Caroline looked up from her desk with the expression she reserved for interruptions, a kind of compressed impatience that managed to communicate without a word that whatever the matter was, it had better be worth her time. Ellie closed the door behind her and set the 2 printed photographs on Caroline's desk. Caroline looked at them, then at Ellie, then back at the photographs. She picked up the first one. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone deciding what to say. It was the silence of someone whose internal architecture was undergoing a rapid and involuntary reorganization. Walls that had stood for years shifting without warning, the structure above them becoming suddenly uncertain. Caroline set the first photograph down and picked up the second. Read it again. "This is a document from a private archive," she said finally. Her voice was even. "It has no legal standing without verification, and the chain of—" "Caroline," Ellie said. Caroline stopped. "I know," Ellie said simply. Another silence. Longer this time. Caroline set the second photograph down with the same careful deliberateness she had once used to set down Ellie's report in the conference room. But it was different now. There was no contempt in it. There was something else, something that Ellie did not have a clean word for, that looked like a person trying to hold themselves together, using only the force of habit. "What exactly do you want?" Caroline asked. Her voice had lost some of its evenness. "Nothing," Ellie said. "I don't want anything from you. I came because you had a right to know." Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her expression, brief and unguarded, and gone almost as quickly as it came. Then she straightened in her chair and looked back at the photographs on her desk and said very quietly, "Get out." Ellie got out. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard it, a sound so faint she might have imagined it, coming from behind Caroline's closed door. Not a word, just the particular quality of silence that follows the moment when someone, finally, alone, allows themselves to feel the thing they have been holding at arm's length. Ellie kept walking. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, and on the landing between 12 and 11, she stopped and sat on the top step and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just allowing herself, for 60 seconds, to be the person this had happened to, rather than the person who was managing it. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and continued down the stairs. She had 3 voicemails from Marcus by the time she reached the lobby. She did not listen to them until she was outside, standing on the Harlow building's front steps, with the cold November air doing its efficient work on her face. The first message was about the Kellerman documents and a next step he wanted to discuss. The second was about a timeline he had been constructing for the billing irregularities. The third was different. His voice in it was careful in the specific way it became when he was saying something that mattered. "I know today was a lot," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that whatever you decide to do next, and with any of it, you're not doing it alone." A pause. "That's all. I'll see you tomorrow." Ellie stood on the steps and listened to it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked out at the street, at the ordinary evening traffic and the lit windows of the buildings opposite, and the small, indifferent movements of a city that did not know and did not need to know what had just happened on its 14th floor. She thought about Helen in the corridor, holding the photographs. She thought about Caroline, alone in her office, behind a closed door. She thought about James Beaumont, who had stood in this same building for 32 years with all of this inside him, and who had looked at her in a corridor 4 months ago with an expression she had not been able to name. She was beginning to be able to name it now. She walked to the subway. She did not sleep much that night, but in the hours before dawn, lying in the particular stillness of a night that has run out of darkness, she arrived at a kind of clarity that was not peace exactly, but was close enough to function as one. She knew what had happened. She knew who was involved. And she knew, with the quiet certainty that had always been the most reliable thing about her, what she was going to do next. James Beaumont died on a Tuesday. It was unremarkable in its mechanics, a cardiac event, swift and decisive, in the private elevator between the 15th and 16th floors. Patricia found him when the elevator doors opened and did not close again. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. He was pronounced dead at the hospital at 4:47 in the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock, the news had moved through the firm the way significant news always moves through closed institutions, quickly, unevenly, in fragments that people assembled into a whole, according to what they already believed about the world. Ellie heard it from Marcus, who appeared at her desk with his jacket still on and said her name once quietly, and she understood from the way he said it that something had shifted in the architecture of the situation they were navigating. She sat with the information for a moment. She had not spoken to James since the conversation in the corridor about Alderton College. She had not confronted him with the birth records, had not arranged a meeting, had not done any of the things that the narrative logic of the situation seemed to require. She had told herself this was strategy, that moving against Richard Holt required timing, and that timing required patience, and that patience required not doing the irreversible thing before the reversible things were finished. This was true. It was also true that she had not been ready, that somewhere beneath the methodical exterior she had spent a lifetime constructing, there was a version of this conversation she had not yet been able to fully imagine, a version where she sat across from the man whose name was on the birth record and asked him directly to account for what he had done. She had not been ready to hear the answer. She had not been ready for the possibility that the answer would be inadequate, which she had known, with the part of her mind that evaluated things clearly, that it almost certainly would be. Now there would be no answer. She was still sitting with that when Marcus set an envelope on her desk. It was cream-colored, business-sized, her name written on the front in a hand she recognized from the margin note in the archive, precise and slightly compressed, the handwriting of someone who had learned to communicate with economy. "Patricia asked me to give it to you," Marcus said. "She said James left instructions that it be delivered to you personally on the day." Ellie looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she picked it up, opened her desk drawer, placed it inside and closed the drawer. Marcus watched this without comment. "Not yet," she said. He nodded. She opened the drawer 3 hours later, alone in the office after the floor had emptied, with the city doing its indifferent nighttime things outside the window. She opened the envelope carefully, the way she opened things that mattered and unfolded the 2 pages inside. The letter was dated 14 months earlier. Ellie, if you are reading this, then the thing I was never courageous enough to do while I was living has been done for me by the simpler mechanism of time. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for a great number of things, and I am aware that a letter is a poor substitute for the conversation I owed you, but it is what I have to offer now, and I am offering it. You were born on April 14th at Crestfield Memorial Hospital at 6:23 in the morning. Your sister was born 11 minutes later. Your mother's name is Helen Marsh. My name is on the documents you may or may not have already found in the cabinet behind the Kellerman files, which I have left where they are because some part of me understood, I think, that you would look. What I did is not something I can justify. I have not tried to in the years since, not to myself, not to anyone. I was a man with a great deal of power and very little courage, and the combination of those 2 things is more dangerous than either one alone. I told Helen that both children had been placed at Sycamore House. I told myself for a long time that I had done it to protect my family. I have known for most of my adult life that I did it to protect myself. I found you when you were 9 years old. A private investigator, a man I trusted, one of the few, located the Sycamore House records and confirmed your placement there. I told myself I would do something with this information. I did not. When you were 17, I learned that your scholarship application to Alderton College had been rejected on financial grounds. I arranged for it to be reconsidered through a third party. I told myself this was something. I understood even then that it was not enough. I have watched your career from a distance that I maintained because closing it required a courage I did not have. When you were recommended to this firm, I was not the one who arranged it. I want you to know that, because I want at least this one thing to be yours entirely, without my interference. You arrived here on your own. You are here because of what you are, not because of anything I did. When I saw you in the corridor on your 3rd week, I was not prepared. I had known intellectually that you worked here. I had not understood until that moment what it would mean to see you. You look like Helen did at your age, and you carry yourself in a way that I recognized, and I was not prepared, and I handled it badly. I am sorry for that too. Caroline does not know about you. She knows she was adopted. I told her that when she was 16, because I felt she deserved to know that much, and because Eleanor's health was declining and I was afraid of what might surface. She does not know that I am her biological father. She does not know about Helen. She does not know about you. What you choose to do with this information is entirely your decision, and I cannot make that choice for you. Richard Holt has known about the birth records for 14 years. He has used that knowledge in the ways you have likely already begun to document. I have allowed this because correcting it would have required me to correct everything else, and I was not willing to do that. This is perhaps the thing I am least able to justify. I have left instructions with my attorney regarding the disposition of my interest in the firm. You will hear from him. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I am not certain I would know what to do with it. What I ask, the only thing, is that you understand that the distance I kept was not indifference. It was the cowardice of a man who loved his children imperfectly and at a remove, and who knew every day that it was not enough. It was not enough. James Ellie read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases, placed it back in the envelope, and sat for a long time in the empty office with her hands flat on the desk and the city lights doing their quiet work outside the window. She did not cry. She had not cried since the conference room on her first week, and she did not cry now, and she did not think this meant she felt less than someone who would have. She thought it meant she was a person who processed things along a different axis, inward and slow and thorough, the way deep water moves. She felt in no particular order, grief for something she had never had, and now definitively never would. anger that was clean and uncomplicated and entirely legitimate, a strange, reluctant tenderness for a man she had never known and would not now know, who had loved her in the only way his particular failures had allowed. And underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a question that had been open her entire life, finally, irrevocably, closing. She knew who she was. She picked up her phone and typed a single message to Marcus. "I read it. I'm okay. We move on Holt tomorrow." His reply came in under a minute. "I'll be ready." She put her phone down, looked at the envelope one more time, and put it in her bag. Then she went to find Caroline. She had not planned this part, but she understood, sitting in the empty office with the letter, that certain things could not be scheduled, that they arrived when they were ready, and that the only useful response was to meet them. Caroline was still in her office. This did not surprise Ellie. In the weeks since their conversation, since the photographs on the desk and the closed door, and the sound Ellie had heard from the corridor, Caroline had been in the building earlier and later than anyone else, which Ellie recognized as the behavior of a person who was using work to hold something at bay. She knocked once. Caroline looked up. She looked, for the first time since Ellie had known her, genuinely tired. Not the performative exhaustion of someone signaling how hard they worked, but the real kind, the kind that settles in the eyes. Ellie came in and sat down across from her without waiting to be invited. She took the envelope from her bag and set it on the desk. "He left this for me," she said. "I think you should read it." Caroline looked at the envelope. She did not move to take it immediately, and Ellie did not push her. She waited the way she had learned to wait for things that could not be hurried. After a moment, Caroline reached out and picked it up. She read it slowly. Ellie watched her face move through the letter's contents with the attentiveness of someone who understood that what she was witnessing was not a performance, that this was a private thing happening in front of her, and that the least she could do was witness it honestly. When Caroline finished, she set the letter down and looked at her hands for a long moment. "He knew," she said. It was not addressed to Ellie specifically. It was the kind of statement people make when they are still in the process of understanding something. "He knew the whole time and he—" She stopped. "Yes," Ellie said quietly. Caroline looked up. Her expression had the raw, unguarded quality of someone whose usual architecture had simply run out of material to work with. The precision, the calculation, the impeccable management of how she appeared to others, all of it had gone somewhere else, leaving behind something that was just a person. "I built everything on him," Caroline said. "Everything I thought I was. Everything I thought I'd earned." Her voice was even, which Ellie understood by now, was not the same as being composed. "And he—" "I know," Ellie said. They sat in silence for a moment that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just honest, which was its own kind of relief. "What do we do about Holt?" Caroline said finally. And there it was, the pivot, the moment where Caroline Beaumont, stripped of every defense she had ever constructed, chose to move forward rather than inward. Ellie had not been certain she would. She was glad. "We take him apart," Ellie said. "Carefully, completely, and in a way that holds." Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the decisiveness of someone who had made a choice and intended to honor it. "Then tell me what you have," she said. What followed was 3 weeks of work that Ellie would later think of as the most focused period of her professional life, and the strangest, because it was conducted in parallel with something that had no professional category at all. She and Caroline did not become close in those 3 weeks. That would have been too fast, and both of them were too honest with themselves to pretend otherwise. What they became was something more functional and, in its way, more durable. Two people who understood each other's capabilities and chose to use them toward a common purpose. Caroline's knowledge of the firm's internal politics was encyclopedic, Ellie's documentation was meticulous. Marcus held the legal strategy together with the steady, methodical intelligence that Ellie had come to rely on, in the way you rely on things that have never once let you down. They built the case against Richard Holt the way good lawyers build anything, from the ground up without shortcuts, making sure every brick was load-bearing before they placed the next one. The billing irregularities were documented across 8 years and 4 cases, with the original records from the archive as the foundation. The letters between James and Holt established the extortion clearly and without ambiguity. The visitor register entry and the 11-day gap in the communication log corroborated the timeline. Marcus prepared a presentation for the firm's ethics board that was 43 pages long and required no embellishment because the facts, arranged in order, were sufficient. They presented it on a Thursday morning in December in the same conference room where Caroline had taken Ellie's report and set it down with 2 fingers. Richard Holt sat across the table and listened with the expression of a man who has spent a long time believing himself to be the smartest person in any given room and is in the process of revising that assessment. He had a lawyer with him, which suggested he had anticipated something, though perhaps not the thoroughness of what was in front of him. The ethics board asked questions. Ellie answered them. Caroline answered them. Marcus answered them. Holt's lawyer intervened twice, and both times was directed politely but firmly back to the documentation. By noon, Holt had been suspended pending investigation by the board and the relevant financial authorities. By the following week, the suspension had become a termination. By January, the matter was in the hands of the prosecutor's office, where it would remain for the better part of 2 years before concluding in the way that thorough documentation, presented clearly, tends to conclude. James's attorney contacted Ellie on the day of the suspension. The terms of the relevant portion of James's will were straightforward: a 15% stake in Beaumont and Associates, held in trust under a provision that had been added 14 months earlier, the same month the letter had been written, was to be transferred to Ellie Brown upon his death, contingent on her being identified and located. The attorney noted, with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering information of this kind, that the provision had been structured carefully enough to withstand challenge. Ellie thanked him, asked for the documentation to be sent to her directly, and ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment afterward, looking at nothing in particular. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, set one on her desk, and sat down in the chair across from her with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years and intended to continue. "Partner," he said, with a small, genuine smile that she had come to understand over the preceding months, meant something specific when it was directed at her. "Not yet," Ellie said. "There's a process." "There is always a process," Marcus agreed. "How do you feel?" Ellie considered the question with the honesty she had learned to bring to things that Marcus asked directly. "Like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time," she said, "and has just put it down, and isn't sure yet what to do with their hands." Marcus nodded. He understood things without needing them explained, which was one of the qualities she had noticed first about him and valued most. "You'll figure it out," he said. She thought he was probably right. The meeting with Helen happened on a Saturday, in a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from the Harlow building that none of them had reason to associate with work. Ellie had arranged it. Caroline had agreed, with the measured reluctance of someone who understood that a thing needed to be done and was not yet certain she had the resources to do it, but was going to try anyway. Helen arrived first and was sitting with her hands around a cup of tea when they came in. Together, which had not been planned, but had happened naturally, the 2 of them falling into step on the pavement outside the building and neither of them remarking on it. Helen looked up when they came through the door, and her face did something complicated and private that she did not attempt to manage or conceal. They sat down. For a moment nobody spoke, and the coffee shop went about its ordinary Saturday business around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of other conversations, the grey December light coming through the window. Then Helen said, "I don't know where to begin." "From the beginning," Caroline said. Her voice was even. "That's where things begin." It was not a gentle thing to say, and Caroline had not intended it to be. But Ellie heard in it something that was not cruelty. It was the voice of a person who had spent a week reading a letter that had dismantled everything she thought she knew, and who had decided, in the absence of the man who owed her answers, to get them from the person who was still here. Helen began from the beginning. She told it the way she had told it to Ellie in the corridor, quietly, without decoration, with the specific honesty of someone who has decided that the time for protective omission is over. She told the parts that were hardest to tell without flinching from them. The decision she had not been given the resources to resist, the years of believing both children were at Sycamore House, the slow and grinding work of finding the records, the 4 years it had taken to find Ellie, the months in the building watching from corridors and windows without the courage to act. Caroline listened without interrupting. Ellie watched her listen. When Helen finished, there was a silence that was different from the ones that had preceded it. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had too much and were choosing carefully. Caroline looked at Helen for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the grey December street. "I had a mother," she said finally. "Her name was Eleanor. She was kind and she was patient and she loved me in a way that I understood, even as a child, was not a simple thing for her. That it cost her something, and that she paid it anyway every day, without asking for anything back." She paused. "She died 4 years ago, and whatever else is true, and whatever my father did, whatever you went through, whatever any of this means, she was my mother. That isn't something this changes." Helen nodded. Her eyes were bright. "I know," Helen said quietly. "I'm not here to change that. I'm not here to ask for anything you don't want to give. I'm here because—" She stopped, gathered herself, and continued. "Because I have spent 30 years looking for you both, and whatever you decide to do with that, I needed you to know it." Caroline looked at her for another long moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and looked at Ellie. "She has your jaw," Caroline said. It was such an unexpected thing, so specific and so small and so entirely devoid of the weight that everything else had been carrying, that Ellie felt something shift in her chest. "I know," she said. Helen made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was somehow both. The forgiveness that was offered at that table was not the clean, conclusive kind that arrives in a single moment and resolves everything neatly. It was the other kind, the kind that is more like a decision than a feeling, made with full knowledge of what it does and does not erase, and extended not because everything is all right, but because the alternative is to carry the weight indefinitely, and the weight is too heavy and the years are too short. It was enough, it was, Ellie thought, exactly enough. The last day of December was a Wednesday, and the Harlow building was running on a skeleton staff, and the 14th floor had the particular quality it got on quiet days, spacious and unhurried, the usual pressure of the place temporarily suspended. Ellie signed the transfer documentation in the early afternoon in a small meeting room on the 15th floor, with the firm's attorney and Marcus present and nobody else. The attorney walked her through each page with the thorough professionalism of someone who understood that this was not a routine transaction, even if he was treating it like one as a courtesy. When she signed the last page, he gathered the documents, shook her hand, and left. Marcus did not say anything immediately, which she appreciated. He sat across from her in the quiet room and let the moment be what it was. Outside, the last afternoon of the year was doing its unremarkable best. Grey sky, a light wind moving along the street below, the city neither celebrating nor mourning, simply continuing. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, for the second time in as many weeks. Ellie thought about it honestly. Like myself, she said. More than I have in a long time. Marcus looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as his version of saying something important without saying it. Steady and warm and entirely unguarded, the face of a person who had decided some time ago that she was worth being unguarded around. She had decided the same thing about him. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up to meet hers without hesitation, and they sat like that for a moment in the quiet room while the last afternoon of the year moved past the window. She thought about Sycamore House in Delford and the scholarship application that had been reconsidered through a third party, and the corridor on the 14th floor where a man had stopped in the middle of a sentence and not quite been able to explain why. She thought about Helen in a coffee shop 3 weeks ago, saying, "I have spent 30 years looking for you both." She thought about Caroline reading a letter with her hands very still, and the sound from behind a closed door that Ellie had heard in a corridor and carried with her ever since. She thought about what it meant to know where you came from, not just the facts of it, the names and dates and documented circumstances, but the full weight of it, the grief and the anger and the reluctant tenderness, all of it together, inseparable, real. And she thought about what came after knowing. That evening, she and Caroline left the building at the same time, a coincidence unremarked upon that had been happening with increasing frequency over the preceding weeks. They came out through the Harlow building's front entrance into the cold December air and stood for a moment on the steps, the city doing its ordinary end-of-year things around them. Helen was sitting on the bench across the street. She had not said she would be there. Ellie had not asked. But she was there with her hands folded in her lap and her patient, self-contained expression, the one she had worn in the reception area on her first day at the firm. The expression, Ellie understood now, of someone who had learned to wait for things she was not certain she deserved. Caroline saw her at the same moment Ellie did. Neither of them crossed the street immediately. They stood on the steps for a moment, and the city moved around them, and the year drew toward its close. Then Ellie stepped down from the steps, and Caroline stepped down beside her, and they crossed the street together. Helen looked up when she heard them coming. This time, neither of them walked past without stopping. Ellie Brown had spent her whole life looking for where she came from. In the end, she found something she hadn't been looking for at all, someone to walk forward with. If Ellie's story moved you, you're not alone. Share it, comment what you felt, and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you here.